What's up, my friends? Welcome to my channel. Today I have a repost of the podcast that I did with my publisher, which is TrineDay. Chris Milligan, who owns TrineDay, and of course Bruce DeTorres. Bruce DeTorres, yeah, that's what it is. I'm going to be on his podcast on Saturday. I will be talking to Ricky Verandas on the ripple effect next week, I believe. But in this video, I'm going to repost the podcast that I did, the appearance that I did. And let's see. Oh, so there's one thing. I was asked about the feasibility. In this podcast, I was asked about the feasibility of releasing a virus of lower virulence to combat a virus of higher virulence. And I said no. And I did make a video actually clarifying, because I was kind of caught off guard. I didn't really have a chance to kind of like respond in a way that would make a lot more sense. And I think the best questions we should ask ourselves is why are these traitors who signed this tripartite agreement, who said we'll turn our heads the other way anytime you have these bioweapons treaties violations, and that would include attacks. And I said, well, maybe if we called them out when they happened, they wouldn't happen in the first place. But we don't, and we turn our heads the other way. And in my video, Blackmail and Biological Warfare, I covered that illegal off-record tripartite agreement that people in U.S. biodefense made with the Soviet Union, and I believe they are traitors, and it was treason. It was a treasonous thing. And it basically ensures and this endless quarrel of biological warfare. So if you go watch my video, it was called The Two Sides of Disease, chronic disease versus acute disease. And I talked about how, because if you released a virus of lower virulence, what happens is it's more immunosuppressive. It starts adding to the chronic disease, and these viruses tend to persist in the environment. I mean, the SARS coronavirus one does too, and I mean, that's not a very lethal virus. I know it has caused a lot of deaths, but a lot of these deaths too were a more complicated picture, and I think there's other organisms, microorganisms involved in a mixed infection, and I talked about that in my book. It is called infectious catarrh, meaning mixed infections. But I don't think we should be adding to the problem, and that is a big problem with our public health system is that they're actually adding to the problem by burning out the immune systems of basically all the Americans that are taking their shots. It is what it is, and I have tried, ad nauseum to show people that I know, hey, look, they hit the same receptors. These antigens that people are injecting, they hit the same receptors, the immune receptors, TLR2 and 1 and TLR2 and 6. So it's going to cause that same chronic disease that you see with things like Lyme disease. But it's like, they understand the Lyme disease part, but when it comes to the shots, they just decide that reality doesn't apply to that. But it does. It doesn't matter if they believe it or not. It does. They still stimulate those receptors and still bring on the immune tolerance. It's very simple. So, without further ado, I will post the podcast and we can get moving here. And with that said, everybody, take care of yourselves. Be yourself, build yourself, and I will see you on the other side.
Welcome to TrineDay's The Journey, conversations with publisher Chris Milligan. I am Bruce DeTorres. With us is A.W. Finnegan. a researcher and writer affected by Lyme disease and immune tolerance, who has been battling health problems since he was young. His new TrineDay book is The Sleeper Agent: The Rise of Lyme Disease, Chronic Illness, and the Great Imitator Antigens of Biological Warfare. And now, Chris Milligan.
Well, thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Adam, very much for coming on. So Adam, the title of this podcast is The Journey. Why? How did you get on this journey looking into Lyme disease and all this crazy stuff?
Well, I became sick in 2016 chronically, but my mother had Lyme disease, a lot of people from my hometown in Grafton, and I had read Lab 257, which Linda Hunt was the first one to mention TRIB, but Lab 257 brought more attention to TRIB, and I had read that book around 2006. That topic had always interested me, like the whole biological warfare thing. And even when I was young, I liked to read books about like the Ebola virus. I remember the Hot Zone. But then it became a personal thing because first my mother got sick, and then some years later I got sick and eventually discovered Lyme disease and some reactivated common viruses, mycoplasma co-infection, and then there's probably other ones, but just not showing up. And so in 2017 was when I decided to start writing the book. And I had been involved in like Lyme disease activism for some time. I met a bunch of girls from an organization called Truth Cures who were showing this immune tolerance phenomenon and why the tests for the Lyme disease and a lot of chronic diseases for that matter are not picking them up, and it's not showing that they're sick even when they are. So, you know, the doctors will send them out the door and just tell them that there's nothing wrong with them. And so we've been getting the runaround for a long time from the public health system. And I started researching all this stuff, and I had put a timeline together in an old site. And I had found John Loftus on Facebook, and when I was on social media, I'm not on it anymore, but I had reached out to him and I told him about my timeline, and eventually he saw it, and then he gave me his number. He said, we want to talk sometime, and I gave him a call, and then he told me that he was involved in a film project and that these other ladies were looking into TRIB. And so eventually he introduced me to them, and we started corresponding. And one of the ladies, Crystal Bennett, was very helpful to me in getting this book. Like a lot of the materials that were, you know, some of it was like the embezzlement investigation, where it was kind of a pricey thing to get from Germany. She was able to offer me some help there to get some of these documents, and a lot of the medical journals that were only available in the German universities, a lot of like TRIB's German work, and a lot of the German work from Insel Reams. And John Loftus was able to give me some hints, and especially on the old Russian connections, which at first I didn't think there was anything to it. And then when I started I was like, well, I'll just give it a try. You know, maybe he's right. And of course, it did not stop producing new leads ever since. I had read a lot of the Russian bioweaponeers work, like Igor V. Domoradsky's BioWarrior, Ken Alabek's book, Biohazard. Then there was another ex-KGB guy who wrote a book called Biological Espionage. And then there was a really big work by the late Raymond Zelinskas called the Soviet Biological Weapons Programs. I read all of those. And then when I started to look into Eric Traub's work, I had noticed that he was actually the one to discover the immune tolerance phenomenon that those girls from Truth Cures had basically taught me about. And I was able to really map the history out, and I was able to tie it, he was the pioneer of the immune tolerance phenomenon with this LCM virus that he discovered at the Rockefeller Institute in 1935. And that kind of set the basis for the stealth disablers, the biological warfare agents that contain that antigen that will induce this immune tolerance phenomenon.
Can you explain the immune tolerance phenomenon?
Another word for it would be chronic immunosuppression. It's immune deficiency. And the reason they call it tolerance is because all of those pathogens that the immune system works hard to keep out of the body, they're not able to keep them out of the body because the immune system is being so overwhelmed that it's forced to tolerate harmful pathogens that it should otherwise be keeping out of the body. And at that point, they integrate into the central nervous system, into the organs, the cardiovascular system. They become very resistant infections. And what also happens is viruses that are dormant within the body, like a lot of the latent herpes viruses, like Epstein-Barr virus and, herpes simplex, a lot of them will reactivate. When they're latent, they're not harmful, but when they're reactivated, even something like herpes simplex becomes a neurotropic virus. It takes to the central nervous system and starts wreaking havoc in it.
Can you give the listeners a little bit of a history of biowarfare and between the great powers and how it happened?
In the first 4 chapters, I describe how biological warfare is something very old that's been with us since the beginning of time, I would say. For example, like a decomposing corpse could be thrown in somebody's drinking well. Britain had been using smallpox as a weapon. The first chapter, I go into how smallpox was used as a weapon, and all they would really do is just use an infected blanket from somebody who had smallpox. They would offer it to the Native Americans, and before you know it, they'd have an epidemic of smallpox. So sometimes they did that to what they claimed was protecting the colonies, which sure they did have some hostility, but it seems that they began to see how effective this actually was. Then we have additional suspicious activity with the potato blight and the Irish potato famine. Although that can't be linked with absolute certainty, it just kind of follows an established pattern. And I basically just say it's suspicious. But then we have another epidemic in 1850 with something called contagious bovine pleuropneumonia, which is Mycoplasma mycoides. And what is interesting is that the same thing was done on the American continent and the Australian continent, where a boat from Britain comes over. They bring one of the cows off the ship and say it has gone dry. They trade the cow for a fresh cow, and then they sail away. But the cow they leave is infected with this contagious bovine pleuropneumonia, and it spread rapidly over the eastern United States. And at precisely the same time, the same was done in Australia, and they too were hit with contagious bovine pleuropneumonia. And of course, what I've tried to tell people, I have a YouTube channel where I will often clarify a lot of points about my book.
What is that YouTube channel called?
At A.W. Finnegan on YouTube, if you look that up. But also, I have my website listed on the back of the book, thesleeperagent.com. And so I have been doing a lot of videos to kind of clarify some things for people. I explain how immune tolerance works, several videos. I basically, anytime I can think of more clarifications that I can think of, I'll make a video. Like the last one I made was to talk about Bergdorfer, Willy Bergdorfer, and how I thought that he was not the one behind this, but that it was Eric Traub. But I have about 17 videos up there, I think, right now, and I will keep making more. And what I explained in one of the videos was what was so desirable about biological warfare, unlike chemical warfare and unlike radio or nuclear warfare, is that they could get away with saying it was an act of nature. They could get away with attacking and saying, well, it was an act of nature. It was something that they could always plausibly deny. So because Germany had used this kind of warfare and got caught in World War I, the League of Nations brought sanctions against Germany, and it took them 92 years to finish paying off that debt. And that was really the point where I think all of the nations realized, hey, we gotta, hide this work. We don't want to get caught, and we don't want to be the next Germany. So it became a very concealed activity and form of warfare. And a lot of the offensive biological warfare is often done under the cover of defensive research. So there was that 1925 Geneva Protocol that banned the use and stockpiling of biological weapons, I believe it was. And then there was an update in 1972 called the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, where they modified it to say that, well, defensive research is okay, but no offensive research. But then that actually gave, like, the Russian bioweaponeer Igor V. Domoravsky was saying in his book that when they signed that 1972 treaty, it actually gave them immense breathing room to actually expand their offensive research, because they could just, it would be covered by law as long as they just said it was defensive research. And I include a lot of quotes like that in the book. So the second chapter goes over a lot of those activities leading up to what was termed the Spanish influenza, and them going around and infecting military horses and medical horses, because horses were often used, to turn out serums, but they were also used in producing certain kinds of agar to grow cultures that would be used for different things. So I made that point in that chapter, and I talked about how after the Spanish influenza, or what was termed the Spanish influenza, I call it the influenza of 1918 because it actually had its start in Kansas. I talk about how Russia suspected that it was a biological weapon, and this kind of fomented a kickoff of events that led to this biological warfare race. In the third and fourth chapters, I go over the Soviet programs. The first four chapters are just kind of priming the reader, and then we go into Eric Traub's life, starting in the fifth chapter.
I was quite amazed at I'd seen one or two books about Soviet biological warfare, but I was really quite amazed. There's not one or two, there's quite a few books about Soviet biological warfare written by people that were involved in it, So yeah. It was a pretty extensive program.
A lot of the books were written by defectors who actually ran it, right? And, then we have Alexander Kuzminov, who wrote Biological Espionage, who was a former KGB agent, and he talked about how they had this big program to infiltrate our public health system, and that they had pretty big plans, since way back. And I mentioned this term Day X. It's something that Kuzminov mentions in Biological Espionage, and he said that it stood for a large-scale war of bioterrorism against the West. And I had made the case that this Day X had already been carried out, and that it was initiated right after 1945, when they decided to start turning their weapons against the United States and the West.
and we have all this, fibromyalgia, all this strange diseases that, people, they seem to go to their doctors, and their doctors say nothing's wrong. And so they get, they get told that it's all in their head.
Oh yeah, that they call that somatoform. But what Eric Traub's research had shown was that a lot of these people are actually sick with a very real disease that they're not imagining. And his research shows how this can be so. It shows how there's very little inflammation involved. They don't have any outward symptoms of disease, but inside they are festering with disease, and they're able to spread virulent viruses, and they have a lot going on. And there is what I call the dark triad of immune tolerance, which is cancer, mental illness, and neurological problems. And I'm not talking about somatoform, but like the neurological problems, which can include psychiatric manifestations for some of those really bad, like neurotropic viruses. So chronic disease, cancer, and mental illness / neurological problems. What Eric Traub found was that there was always this secondary effect on the brain anytime there was this immune tolerance or chronic immunosuppression phenomenon. And what he had also discovered was that he could raise the cancer rate to 50%. And he talked about how with his LCM virus, he could find 1 of 2 mice in the wild that were persistently infected with LCM virus had leukemia. A lot of people can't really understand what's the purpose of a biological weapon that takes a long time to incubate and doesn't kill you right away. But I try to explain in the preliminary discussion of my book before we get started, is that there are 2 classes of biological warfare agents. There's those that do kill quickly, and those are considered tactical bioweapons. And then you have these other biological weapons called strategic bioweapons, which they are more strategic. They are used for a long-term strategies of tire and exhaust. And if you think about it, when somebody dies, they are either buried or they're cremated. But when you have people that are very sick and chronically ill, they're exhausted, they can't work, it puts a serious strain on the public health system, and it puts a serious strain on the economy. Oftentimes someone will have to take care of that person or pick up their slack. It really overwhelms the system, especially the public health system, when they're not even acknowledging these diseases. Things have become so bad lately. For myself, I just completely stopped going in because it got to a point where they could do absolutely nothing for me. And a lot of times they will suggest things like they will assume that somebody has an autoimmune disease and start giving them immunosuppressants when what is considered autoimmune actually happens in parallel with immune tolerance, and giving somebody further immunosuppression can actually be quite dangerous. So the book has such wide implications, and it's just crazy to me when I take in the full scope, and it's kind of like somebody is not going to be happy about this, or many people are not going to be happy about this.
And the other thing that really amazed me in this book is all the these secret agreements between the Germans and the Russians. Okay, and then how Traub kind of moved between the Russians and the Germans, and then you had one of the Cambridge Five, a British spy, place him over here in the United States on Plum Island. I mean,
and it was not just Plum Island. He was also at Beltsville in the Beltsville station of the USDA. He was at Plum Island. He was also at Bethesda Maryland, the Naval Medical Research Institute, and they put him as a supervisory bacteriologist. He was overseeing a lot of these simulant activities. He was extremely high up in the biological warfare program when we took him over here.
And so you've got this situation where, you know, a lot of people don't understand that there's this war going on between sovereign countries with this biological material. I'm going to ask us to wade into some deep waters here. We had a situation here. We had a pandemic, a COVID thing, okay? And, you know, a lot of people think that the public health measures were completely overboard and that, you know, people shouldn't be isolated and stuff like that. And then, you know, when I talk to Mr. Loftus, you know, he talks about this factory in Russia that blew up in October of 2019. And
yeah,
what are your thoughts and what do you think about all this?
Yeah, me and him see eye to eye on its origins with this vector lab. And I have published research where it was from Australia, but it was published research, and it was a biodefense organization, and they were talking about hoping for the best but expecting the worst after this vector explosion. And they were saying in that paper that SARS was being noted in Russia, spreading at that time. And then eventually what happened is somebody in China, eventually it made its way down to China. Somebody got sick. The Wuhan lab found out about it, went over there, isolated the agent from them, then took it back to the Wuhan lab, and then it looks like all of them got sick too. That's what I think happened. When you understand this whole war that's been playing out heavily between the United States and Russia, they were always the one who were in the lead with these kinds of agents that contain these, what I call the great imitator antigen. And they had Eric Traub. They had him before we did, and they hauled all of his Insel Reams work off to Russia. So they had a leg up on us for a long time when they were able to assimilate all of that research. What I had found was that this vector lab, they were experimenting with putting these HIV-like antigens on things like common cold viruses. It wasn't surprising when that all started to unravel, and we had been talking about it. Me and Loftus had been talking about this was a possibility before it even started. And that vector explosion, that's what I think happened. And there's substantial evidence to substantiate it. Now, the Wuhan lab certainly would have been working with coronaviruses, just like a lot of other labs too. So I'm sure that they had nefarious activities going on as well. But I think what it seems to have happened is that somebody got sick in China, not at the Wuhan lab, but the Wuhan lab folks went over there to isolate it, brought it back to that lab, and they didn't really know what they were actually dealing with. And it looks like a lot of them got sick from it.
Let me run a posit past you. Now, you're a country and you've been attacked with a biowarfare program, okay? And you've been doing your research too, and your offensive or defensive research. So one thing that you might do is put out in your country something similar, but isn't as lethal, to push the other one out of the country. Is that a possibility? Or
are you saying to create a virus that is
not as lethal, but still gives the people some of the antigens or whatever you call them to push the more lethal virus out of the country.
Yeah, I don't think that's a good idea either.
Oh, okay.
It's tricky with this virus because there's something what is called HLA. Just as there are variants of the immune system, of variants of viruses, there are variants of the immune system. And so if they had mapped out and understood HLA better, they could probably figure out who is at most risk for things like this, and they could probably come up with better ways of dealing with this. But I think there are bigger problems within our system. What Eric Traub's research shows is that there are fundamental flaws with our understanding of immunology. Now, there is something called the interference phenomena, which states that certain pathogens will destroy immune receptors that make infection with other viruses harder. But the problem is those things can have their own problems too. Eric Traub had published several papers about this, and he had talked about how he thought that the antibodies were not the sole determinant of immunity. And he talked about how, his whole immune tolerance phenomenon, it would kind of throw the entire paradigm of current immunology into disarray. The other problem that I foresee with the current situation is Big Pharma does have a problem with wanting to profiteer. And I think if they had started looking into the HLA thing, they would see that there's only a small portion of people at any given time that are susceptible to certain diseases. And then that would bring profit margin way down. And I think they're just really addicted to money. And then the other problem we have, where sometimes people would think is conspiracy and may actually be in relation to foreign governments, is this Soviet infiltration that I foresee in my book. Especially in the last chapters, where some of our scientists were getting really cozy with their bioweaponeers. And then having Shumakov, the son of a serious Soviet bioweaponeer, as heading vaccine safety and review at the FDA I think is a position that is just far too risky to put somebody like that in, even if he had good intentions. But it brings up a lot to discuss when we understand Eric Traub's immune tolerance.
Yeah, Loftus talks about, Traub being able to do, gene splicing before like our CRISPR type stuff. And
so this was bioengineering before the days of recombinant DNA.
Yeah.
Using animal passages. Basically, it made it so that you could always blame an animal in nature, right? That's why it left no footprints. And even today, with the current recombinant DNA technology, nobody will use it. Nobody will use it to produce a biological weapon because it leaves footprints of tampering. If I have animals in a lab and I'm alternating these passages between a bat and a sea snake, because certain animals brought desired mutations. I don't know why, but they mutated certain ways in certain animals. And that's what Eric Traub had noted. And it became like a fine art for him. And I talk about that on my YouTube channel. I explain the process of animal passages and how it became rather complex and how good Eric Traub had got at it. And it's why veterinarians made the best bioweaponeers, because they understood a diverse range of different immune systems and these varying tropisms that each animal brought, when mutating a biological warfare agent.
Do you have is there something I didn't ask you about or something you would like to say that we didn't cover?
All I can say is the book is of immense importance when understanding the current situation we're in, and especially these laws about allowing open air testing and allowing them to do whatever they feel. You know, I understand the need to protect against biological warfare, but also what the simulant program has shown us is that often the ones who are claiming to protect are doing the most harm, even if it's unintentional. You know, because when we have people in that system, you know, like when they brought Eric Chaub over here, doing these open air tests only just, it made things infinitely worse. And they were saying we need to do these tests to protect against biological warfare, even though people were dying from the tests. And these laws like Title 1520 that allows these testing, and I cover on my YouTube channel those laws that allow, and still to today have actually expanded upon those laws so that we're not even told, and they don't have to tell us, and they can basically do whatever they want. And I made the case that, you know, sometimes the road to hell is paved with the best intentions. Because I don't tell people that it's any kind of conspiracy, other than I say there's a lot of stupidity and just learning nothing from the past. So that's kind of what I get into in this book.
Bruce, do you have any comments or questions?
Yes, a few. Adam, earlier you mentioned Grafton, the town where your mom got sick, you got sick. Grafton, in what state is that?
Massachusetts.
All right, thank you. This German scientist, after going to Russia after World War II, Eric Traub, came here, and with things like research on Plum Island, many elements or viruses or antigens were developed and tested or inflicted on the American people, often with the full knowledge of the Americans involved, but it was kind of a Soviet intentional sickening of us. So maybe the Americans in charge, seeing testing and sickening Americans, were happy to do that because they greedily thought, well, at least we're developing a potent weapon, and we don't care if we're sickening increasing generations of Americans, because the chronic illnesses you described is a ever ballooning and worsening situation since the 40s and 50s. Is that generally, did I capture that? Did I put that together in my head more or less correctly like that?
Yeah, and what Eric Traub had also found was that a lot of these nasty viruses, when reactivated, could be transmitted down generations and become more nasty with each generation, while raising the cancer rate as well.
What is known as the Spanish flu? Who intentionally got horses sick, and was that the genesis of the entirety of what is known as the Spanish flu?
I do cover that in the second chapter, and one of the leads I got from John Loftus was that the Russians thought that it was a British biological weapon, and I went over some of the evidence that suggests that, you know, that actually could be possible. There's nothing that can be proven, but they did have all this research going on about viral and bacterial synergy, because the Spanish influenza, a lot of the deaths that would occur when this secondary bacterial pneumonia would come online after the initial viral infection.
Thanks, Adam. I have no other questions.
Along with the moneymaker thing, with our public health system reliance on money making, also a major problem with when it comes to infiltration. It looks like there was an infiltration mess that was never ever cleaned up. And in the very last chapter, I point out some really just suspicious relations between some of our public health people and their bioweaponeers, like Chumakov. And so that too also comes into play. And I think there's a lot of unfriendly truths that perhaps a lot of people in the public health system don't want to face.
Amen.
And I think that really sums it up there.
Well, hopefully at some point in time we might understand more of this. But I want to thank you very much, Adam. And I strongly recommend people get his book, The Sleeper Agent. It is the deepest dive into biowarfare that I have seen, and really explains a lot of the situation, and onwards to a better future for our children.
Yeah, onwards.